Most of you know Teddy Roosevelt as the 33rd governor of New York, but it's actually a little known fact that he was president of the United States from 1901 through 1909. As president, he ushered in numerous progressive policies such as breaking up powerful monopolies, improving housing conditions, and reforming Food and Drug Administration by creating the FDA. When his successor, William Howard Taft, was elected, Roosevelt expected him to build upon his progressive ideas, but instead found Taft to be too conservative for his tastes. Because of this, he decided to try and dethrone Taft in the 1912 election and continue on his progressive policies, some of which included women's suffrage, Social Security, and an 8-hour workday. In the 1912 primaries, Roosevelt almost won the nomination and actually gained more than twice as many delegates in the primaries as Taft, but the party insiders instead chose Taft as the nominee at the Republican National Convention as they felt that Roosevelt was too liberal. This angered Roosevelt, who chose to run on a third-party platform. The reason why neither Taft nor Roosevelt won the actual election in our timeline was due to the Republican vote being split between the liberal Republicans led by Roosevelt and the conservative Republicans led by Taft. This allowed Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic nominee, to win in traditionally Republican states where the vote was split between Taft and Roosevelt. Had Taft chosen not to run, Roosevelt most likely would have secured the Republican nomination and would go head-to-head with Wilson. In this scenario, Roosevelt most likely would have won every state where, in our timeline, the combined Taft and Roosevelt vote surpassed Wilson's vote. This would give Roosevelt 379 electoral votes compared to Wilson's 152 for mostly southern states. Soon after, Teddy Roosevelt would be sworn in as the 28th President of the United States. Upon election, Roosevelt would first work towards reversing a great deal of Taft's conservative policies. This was an extremely big part of Roosevelt's 1912 agenda, so I would expect this to be one of the first things he would set out to do. Meanwhile, Roosevelt would begin to express concerns over the situation in Europe. He would take note of the extremely high tensions and would likely begin drafting secret war plans in preparation for American involvement in case of war. This is because Roosevelt was known for making a big show of American strength and would almost certainly see the political situation in Europe as an excuse to do so. 1 year into Roosevelt's third term, World War I would break out in Europe. In our timeline, Woodrow Wilson tried his best to stay out of the conflict and refused to talk about it on multiple occasions, while Roosevelt, meanwhile, heavily commented on it despite no longer holding any political office. In this timeline, Roosevelt would have the executive power to bring the United States into war and would be looking for a way to do so, as he saw the war as a way for the United States to show off itself as a major power equal to those of Europe. This contrasts with Wilson in our timeline, who saw it as imperial powers squabbling over minor disputes. By now, World War I would be in full swing and would engulf worldwide headlines for the time being. The United States would still be on the sidelines of the conflict, but would show a clear affinity for the Entente, as the American people would feel angry at the Germans due to the atrocities they were committing in Belgium. Since Teddy Roosevelt desperately wanted the United States to be a part of World War I would expect propaganda to be displayed in the American media, promoting the idea of American involvement to get the public on his side. For now, public opinion of the United States joining the war would continue to be in the slight negation, that is, until the sinking of the Lusitania. In our timeline, the sinking of the Lusitania enraged Roosevelt, as a great deal of Americans died on board, and the American government was doing nothing to avenge them. In this timeline, the propaganda distributed throughout the country would have already put the public into the consideration of fighting in the war. The sinking of the Lusitania would be just enough to push the already ireful public into supporting American involvement. With the public on his side, and American blood having been spilled, Roosevelt would formally declare war on the German Empire and join forces with the Entente. In our timeline, even though the United States declared war in 1917, American troops didn't actually arrive to Europe until the spring of 1918, just a few months before the war's end. The deployment of American troops in our timeline was still very important, as French troops were beginning to face mutinies. The morale was so low that many historians agree that France may have simply given up, and that it was only when the Americans showed up that the French received the energy to continue fighting. By that point, the Germans had already been successful in the Eastern Front, as Russia dropped out due to the Communist Revolution and completely focused their efforts towards Western Europe. In this timeline, the Americans would show up around January of 1916, while the Germans are still fighting a two-front war. Because Roosevelt would most likely want to end the war extremely quickly as a show of American strength, he would likely send more than 28% more troops than in our timeline, which could number up to 3 million American troops. At the same time, German forces would be stretched thin, trying to force a capitulation out of Russia in the east, along with France and England in the west. In our timeline, the Germans knew that if they weren't able to to defeat a weakened France with the support of a few 100,000 Americans, they would be screwed. In this timeline, France would still be at reasonable strength with the support of millions of Americans, giving the Germans a greater need to win in the West. The Germans would know that their current troop layout would cause them to lose very quickly, which is why they would likely send a great deal of their eastern troops west to fight the newly deployed Americans. Seeing a loss of German troops in the east, the Russians might possibly make some minor land gains. This could possibly delay the impending communist revolution, as the Russian people are seeing Russian victories in the war for the first time. Despite the Germans' best efforts, they wouldn't possess the manpower necessary to fight a two-front war against the Entente, who just received a bulk of American reinforcement. They wouldn't be able to get much help from Austria-Hungary or the Ottoman Empire, as each of these nations would be facing their own internal conflicts by now. With the help of British commander Lawrence of Arabia, the Saudis would be creating turmoil within the Ottoman Empire, which would force it to drop out of the war in order to preserve the empire's continuation. Meanwhile, the Slavic ethnic groups within the Austro-Hungarian Empire would be fed up of losing a war for a country they didn't feel represented them, which could lead to internal rebellion. This would leave the German Empire as the last powerful nation in the Central Powers. Realizing this, the United States, Britain, France, and Russia would use the bulk of their manpower and resources to force Germany to surrender. By now, the Central Powers would be in a frenzy, as the Entente are pushing deeper into German, Austrian, and Ottoman homelands with no way to repel them. With no option left, the Central Powers would surrender around November of 1916. When it comes to the treatment of the Central Powers after the war, Germany would still lose a great deal of land to the Entente, just like in our timeline, but because the war only lasted half as long as it did in our timeline, the Germans would be treated much less harshly, and their land losses wouldn't be as substantial as they were in our timeline. When it comes to Austria-Hungary, they would undergo a massive civil war that would lead to the collapse of the empire, allowing new nation-states to take its place. The Ottoman Empire would lose their Arabian provinces, Iraq, Syria, and all else except for Anatolia. The Ottoman Sultanate may survive, but will no longer be the true Islamic Caliph, as their country is no longer in possession of the cities of Mecca or Medina. As for the victors of World War I, the world stage would look much different than it did in our timeline. One of the most prominent features of this new world would be the continuation of the Russian Empire. In our timeline, Lenin used the fact that Russia was losing the war as a platform to sprout his revolution, overthrow the Tsar, and establish communism. He wouldn't be able to do that in this timeline, as the Russian people would see a victory in the war. Despite this, I would still expect some form of a communist revolution to break out within the Russian Empire. Unlike our timeline, this revolution will go nowhere, as the Americans would likely send some of their own troops to help squash the rebellion. While Teddy Roosevelt was known for breaking up monopolies, he was still a staunch capitalist. This means that he wouldn't ever allow the USSR to exist, as it could spread socialist ideas to the United States, which would clash with his own economic policies. Meanwhile, he would also advocate for a friendlier approach to the war-torn Germany. When it came to the Spanish-American War a few years prior, Roosevelt wanted to mend relations with Spain and make the country an ally to the US, but this wasn't carried through as he had no executive power at the time. I would expect him to have the same approach to Germany, except now he actually has the executive power for his ideals to come to fruition. If this friendly approach to Germany were to happen, then there is a greater than 90% chance that the Nazi Party would never rise to prominence. In our timeline, the party only became a leading political force as Germany was in severe financial debt during the worst economic downturn in history. This led to people joining extremist political factions, including the Nazis. In this timeline, the party wouldn't have a severe debt crisis to write off of, meaning that the German people have no reason to follow the extreme right-wing Nazi ideology. Roosevelt died in 1917, meaning that if the war were to end in 1916, he would still be able to put these plans of a friendly German approach and squashing communist revolutionaries into action. Beyond that, it would be impossible to say how his future foreign policy would go, except that I wouldn't expect him to create the League of Nations. That organization was the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson, and since he wouldn't hold executive power in this timeline, it might never go into effect. Roosevelt's domestic policy would create much of what we see as standard today much earlier than in our timeline. As mentioned before, Roosevelt was an advocate of an 8-hour workday, a social security program, and women's suffrage. Because a great deal of his presidency was dedicated towards World War I, was cut short due to a sudden case of death, and Congress was controlled by Democrats, I wouldn't expect all of these policies to pass through. Despite that, I could still expect at least one of them to pass through and be implemented, as many congressional Democrats at the time held progressive views similar to Roosevelt. But to conclude, Teddy Roosevelt winning the 1912 election would put us in a better world today than one where Wilson won. The Soviet Union would never exist, the Nazis would never rise to prominence, and either an 8-hour workday, social security, or ratified women's suffrage might exist decades earlier than in our timeline. Still, I would like to thank you for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe.